Thanks a lot, Isota, and thank you all for listening and attending, and also thank you to WWP for inviting me to have the possibility to share my reflections on this issue and this topic that I think is highly important in many different ways. It's a big issue. So in terms of having 30 minutes, I was clear about what I will try to do to the best of my ability is to reflect on this issue about trauma-informed work and try to formulate and in hopefully a clear way what kind of questions this issue is raising concerning our common effort to try to combat violence against women and children as a problem to society. I hope also it was very fulfilling to listen to both Chris and Kieran's keynotes, and I hope my contribution and my perspective will place itself somewhat nicely together with the previous presentations. First of all, it's a little bit too much text in this, but it's to squeeze together the necessary information about where I come from. Isota, you had a nice introduction, I think, and this is about the organization I'm working in and work as the executive director. I've been in Alternative to Violence, ATV, since the very start in 1987. That is my work project in life, and as it says, we were the first specialized treatment center for male batterers in Europe back then when we started. Today we are a therapy and documentation center for domestic violence. We are working with both adult offenders, adolescents, both as victims, but also as adolescents that has developed problems with violence and aggression. We work with adult victims of domestic violence, and we work with children having experienced domestic violence or experiencing domestic violence in their upbringing home. ATV is an NGO. We are based on public funding. ATV is spread out through Norway through 15 offices, and we are a staff of about 100 people working with domestic violence full-time. Referring to our annual report, both from 2021 and 2022, we have around 2,000 plus men, women, and children in therapy. And it's also a big issue to debate and discuss the fact in terms of mandatory treatment or voluntary treatment. Our basis is voluntary treatment, although we are in close contact with all the other agencies in this field in terms of child protection, social welfare system, police, healthcare units, etc., etc. The work of ATV is based on an understanding of gender, power, and culture in society. It's based on actually the stories of battered women battering men and children that we are actually seeing, which is teaching us about the different realities of violence in people's everyday life. And of course, it's also based on professional clinical psychology and research. We are a supplement to the public bodies in our society and structure, and our specific and overriding objective is to do all we can to contribute to make the violence stop. That is a very specific assignment to our organization. One of the reasons I've found it very intriguing and interesting to say yes to this invitation is that the issue of trauma-informed work is not only an issue about trauma-informed work. It's also raising the basic questions we are still struggling with after 20, 30, 40 years in this field of work. It's highlighting the basic questions about what we are thinking around the causes of domestic violence. Of course, as a part of that, due to what we see as the causes, we have some thoughts about what would be the appropriate interventions. In other words, are the medicine we describe, meaning interventions reflecting our knowledge about the causes of the problem? So this is, I'm going to stick fairly much to trauma-informed work in itself as a specific issue, but it's important for me to actually comment on this as I'm doing now, in terms of this is actually one aspect of continuing discussing the very basic issues and questions and challenges in our field. And by now, on all levels in society, we really know that perpetrating violence is representing a complex issue. This is not a simple case, it's really a complex issue. The historic background that we are leaning on is, of course, the paramount and important work of the women's movement. And but also this historic point is important because the first proposed analysis of men's violence was that men's violence was about patriarchal attitudes and toxic masculinities. It's one of my messages today that in my view and in my reflections, this is still very important. But by 2023, we know that that is not enough. We need to combine this with other perspectives, like what role is trauma playing in this? Not trauma in general, but as I will use as a specific example, trauma related to being children or a child and experiencing violence in your upbringing home. So, to make a step to stand on in terms of arguing, as you will understand, that I think it's both important and necessary and possible to combine different perspectives and aspects. What was highlighted in the women's movement's first analysis was that children experiencing violence at home were exposed to male role models in terms of their fathers on how men should be. And as I said, that is an important perspective. But what was, I think, lacking in the first analysis was also the fact that being exposed to violence as a child in your own home is also traumatizing for children. And to end this lens or perspective, I think it's also an important issue to be aware of, that from the start we had analysis that was based on a group level or a perspective on society, and there is a big problem and a challenge in how to apply models from a group level onto the individual level, trying to apply them into the treatment work with individuals. That is not a one-dimensional process, to put it mildly. We also know that the consequences, both the frequency, as Kieran was referring to, and Chris, but also the consequences. We know a lot about the psychological impact and the consequences of being exposed to violence as children, and the effects on the general well-being of children when they become adults. I won't get more into this. I just think it's important to include the knowledge coming out of the ACE study into this focus we have and this issue we are discussing today. Also, as a historic reference, in the Nordic countries, the historic tradition has been actually very much from the start, as I have been arguing and will be arguing, that we need to combine the perspective of men's violence being about patriarchal attitudes and masculinities with the significance of violence-related individual experiences in their life histories. What is characterizing our input approach to work with adults, mostly men, perpetrating violence, is that we need, as professionals, to be aware of the fact that violence is, of course, a problem in itself, but it's also represented a kind of a gendered symptom of a psychological background issues and problem. So that's to us two different aspects and qualities about violence that we need to take into account when we are trying to design approaches and ways of working with the aim of producing sustainable change. It's in my pretext. It said I was going to illustrate with a few vignettes. I think it's only time for one, and I feel also the need to comment that there is, I hope it is an illustrative example, but it's also a kind of a caution for me that I don't mean that this is representative for all cases of men perpetrating violence. This is one example, and the case and the situation may be very different for different persons. Carl, I saw him as coming as a client, as we call them, into our program, our services. This was about 10 years ago, and due to the development of society in terms of modernization, in terms of being quite radical in terms of gender equality work in society, it was a little bit strange to meet such a young man having a very classic, old-fashioned patriarchal attitudes. He was arguing and defending, if you know what I mean, his behavior with the reasoning in terms of being the head of the family, and etc., etc. In the beginning, I was a bit curious about his also his life experiences, although my main focus was on how the violence actually looked like in present time. He was reluctant to talk about that in the beginning. We had a focus on exploring and also challenging the meaning and the logic of his reasoning and explanation. And said in short, we managed successfully to work on his attitudes. He was critically throwing them away as a part of the process, and which was to me a good process. It was what I was hoping for. What was disturbing, though, was that although he had changed, I think he really changed his attitudes towards his own violent behavior. But the problem was that the violence was continuing. And that made me a bit, I don't know what's the right English word. It made me think, what's the problem here? And I thought I was expecting his violent behavior to change more accordingly to the change in his attitudes. This was the beginning of a process where I was highlighting also my curiosity about his life experiences. And of course, in our context today, it has to be in brief. It turns out, and we are managing to dive in also into his violence-related life experiences. He was exposed to high-risk, severe violence in his upbringing home. He was left alone with these experiences. Over time, he did, like many children do, in handling traumatic experiences, in terms of making sense to them, in terms of thinking he was the problem, it was something wrong with him, which in turn, of course, affected his self-image and his thoughts about his self-worth quite extensively. So he entered, to put it in general terms, he entered adult life and close relationship life with an idea and a working hypothesis that I have no worth whatsoever. So if I'm going to have a partner and a family, I need to hold on to a woman by force. I hope the internal logic in that way of understanding himself is illustrated. So we also had to work on his experience with violence in general, and also his traumatic experiences with violence as a child, in order to gain that change in terms of actually the violence going away. I hope the vignette and the presentation of Carl makes my point fairly clear. I'm not going to go into how we work in alternative to violence. Our treatment model is centered around central issues around violence, including the violence itself. We need to work on those listed points here as themes and work thoroughly on all of them. Our experience is that the physical violence is stopping fairly quickly. The psychological violence and other forms takes longer time. And if the family is, if they are staying on as a family, also the need for reparational work is almost always coming up. From here on to more specifically about what trauma-informed work is about, because that is, of course, something different from actually working with the trauma experiences and process them. In this setting and in this perspective, there is an argument that we need, as professionals working with perpetrator programs, we need to have a basic knowledge and understanding, and in this respect, an awareness of the possibility that violence can be rooted in many things, including traumatic experiences in general, but more specifically also connected to experiencing violence as children. And in this context, we are also then talking about complex trauma, because this is not a single experience. This being exposed to violence is a repeated trauma to children when they are experiencing that. And it's not from anybody, and the inflictor is not anybody. It's actually one of the caregivers and the significant others of children. An important part of the trauma-informed knowledge is to have some basic ideas about and basic knowledge about how trauma is affecting the brain. And the person that really lifted this knowledge on a research basis was Bruce Perry in the US. And his main point was that being exposed to trauma like violence is affecting the limbic system part of the brain, which is illustrated with the blue color in the picture, which is regulating and the center for both the attachment system, the crisis management, on a neurological level, emotion processing and memory. And this is directly significant and related to neurological consequences of being traumatized. In this case, we are focusing on violence, experiencing violence as children as the source of the traumatization. This field of knowledge is an overriding perspective in the knowledge on the implications on a brain level, is that children with these experiences are in high risk for developing problems with regulation in general, both regulation of emotions, regulation of relationships to others, in specific also intimate relationships, difficulties in regulating own reaction patterns, suddenly arousal in terms of experiencing that things is just suddenly happening to me, and also difficulties in understanding oneself as a person and understanding my own reaction in life, both with reference to myself, but also in relationship to others. A professor of psychology at the University of Gothenburg proposed in one of our Nordic conferences with the focus on these issues, the hypothesis that violence as a predominantly male attachment style, actually thinking of using violence towards your closest one is actually a form, or is a new form of an attachment style, which I think is interesting to think about. What is the general recommendation in terms of practicing a trauma-informed awareness and a trauma-informed knowledge base? I think also into the perpetrator program is it's described as the three pillars of trauma-informed work. One being focusing on safety, creating a safe environment, a perceived safe environment, working on the working relationship between the facilitator, therapist, and the client to feel as a safe working relation, and also use the program or the treatment setting to train on affect regulation. So this is about taking into account the possibility that the client is carrying a trauma history. We as professionals running perpetrator programs and treatment services, the recommendation is that we are integrating the trauma-informed perspective into our work and into our hypothesis about what would be useful and effective. So to close off, I haven't been talking in detail about the work we are doing, but the four thematic focus points that I was briefly into is taking into account that we need to combine a focus on both responsibility, accountability, and challenging patriarchal beliefs and attitudes, but combining it with also working on the trauma and neglect history, and the fact that most of our clients have experienced violence as children at home, and as a consequence of that also include and working on attachment difficulties, and also, as I just mentioned, highlighting and exploring how to train on emotion regulation.